June 1944, and the convoy arrives on schedule, but the holds are wrong. Ammunition crates that should be topside are buried under rations. Medical supplies meant for the beachhead are still lashed in compartments 3 ships back. The Marine commander on the beach radios for artillery shells and receives a manifest showing them loaded, but no one can find them, not in 4 hours, not in 8. The invasion schedule hemorrhages time while deck crews tear through cargo bays, hunting for ordnance that exists on paper but not in reach. The Navy promised a floating railroad that would deliver war material with the precision of a stateside depot, a revolutionary mobile supply line that needed no ports, no fixed bases, no vulnerable infrastructure the enemy could destroy. Instead, it delivered chaos wrapped in procedure, a system so elegant in concept that no one questioned whether it could actually work until ships were already anchored off hostile islands with Marines counting rounds. Quiet reports had circulated through logistics channels months earlier, technical assessments buried in routine paperwork, suggestions that the loadout sequencing might not survive contact with combat operations. Someone knew this magnificent machine had a fatal flaw. Yet the convoys sailed anyway, fully loaded with everything except the ability to deliver it when men needed it most. If the floating railroad was always going to fail, why did the Navy bet the Pacific campaign on a logistics theory no one had proven could survive a real beach? The disaster crystallizes at Saipan in June 1944, where 15,000 Marines hit the beaches expecting the Navy's new service Squadron 10 to function exactly as advertised, a mobile supply depot capable of sorting, storing, and delivering 20,000 different items from floating warehouses anchored just offshore. The invasion plan depends entirely on this system because Saipan has no port, no docks, no infrastructure, nothing but coral and Japanese guns, which means every round, every bandage, every ration must flow from ship to shore through the floating railroad or the campaign dies on the beach. Within 18 hours of the first wave, the system starts fracturing in ways no one anticipated. Ammunition ships carry the shells the Marines need, but those shells are stowed in sequence for textbook invasion that doesn't match the actual battle unfolding on the ridge lines, so working parties have to break open hatches and dig through tons of incorrectly prioritized cargo while enemy artillery finds the range on stationary vessels. The issue storeships, those revolutionary floating warehouses stocked like stateside supply depots with everything cataloged and accessible, turn out to be accessible only in theory because items are stored by alphanumeric designation across multiple holds and no one thought about what happens when you need 5 different items from 5 different compartments while the ship is also trying to maneuver away from submarine contacts. Requisitions that should take minutes stretch into hours, then days. A supply officer's search manifests that don't match the actual stowage because cargo was shifted during the voyage and no one updated the paperwork. On the 3rd day, a battalion on the northern perimeter runs critically low on mortar ammunition and sends an urgent request through channels, and the request is received and confirmed and the ammunition definitely exists somewhere in a task group. But locating it requires searching through 4 separate vessels because the loadout plan distributed munitions across the squadron for weight distribution and safety, which makes perfect sense until you actually need something fast. The shells are found on the 5th day, delivered to a position the battalion vacated 2 days earlier after taking 30% casualties holding ground they might have kept if the floating railroad had delivered what it promised when it was promised. Meanwhile, medical supplies stack up on the weather decks of some ships while hospital ships 1,500 yards away radio desperately for surgical kits and plasma that exist in abundance but cannot be transferred quickly because the system has no priority override, no way to break the careful sequence and just get the critical item to the critical place. Engineers ashore need specific bridging equipment cataloged and loaded in California 6 weeks ago, and that equipment is definitely present in the anchorage, spread across 3 cargo vessels. But assembling a complete bridging unit requires coordinating transfers between ships that are also servicing 40 other requests, and the whole elegant system that looked flawless on paper in Pearl Harbor is now drowning in its own complexity while Marines dig in with half-loads and pray the Japanese don't probe the weak points that exist because boxes are on the wrong ships. By day 7, the beachhead is secure, but the supply situation is catastrophic enough that Admiral Turner personally intervenes, ordering ships to break open holds and simply dump priority cargo onto lighters regardless of procedure, which works but only by abandoning the entire concept the floating railroad was built on. Only by admitting that the revolutionary system cannot actually do what it was designed to do under real combat conditions where the enemy doesn't follow the loadout plan and men need specific things immediately, not eventually. The floating railroad wasn't supposed to fail because it was born from a genuine strategic problem that threatened the entire Pacific campaign. The Navy was island hopping across 5,000 miles of ocean toward Japan, seizing coral atolls and volcanic rocks that had no infrastructure, no harbors, no facilities of any kind, and every captured island needed to become an instant supply base capable of supporting the next operation while also sustaining its own garrison against counterattack. The traditional solution: build ports and depots on each conquered island, 8 months of time, and required construction battalions, materials, and defensive positions that made every island a fixed target the Japanese could locate and attack. Admiral Nimitz and his logistics staff looked at the map in 1943 and realized that if they kept building stationary bases, the war would still be going in 1950, so they needed something radically different, something mobile that could move with the fleet and deliver everything an island base could deliver without ever staying in one place long enough to become a target. The concept they developed was elegant and unprecedented: a complete floating supply infrastructure built into specialized ships that would travel with a combat fleet, anchoring off each new objective to provide instant logistic support without touching land. Service Squadron 10 would function as a mobile Pearl Harbor, a self-contained supply ecosystem organized exactly like a stateside naval depot with separate ships functioning as specific departments: issue stores for general supplies, ammunition ships for ordnance, provision ships for food, repair ships for maintenance, hospital ships for medical care, even floating distilleries for fresh water and tankers for fuel, all cross-referenced in a master catalog system that theoretically allowed any item to be requisitioned and delivered as efficiently as walking into a warehouse in San Diego. The ships themselves were marvels of organizational theory, with issue store ships carrying up to 20,000 separate line items sorted by alphanumeric codes, stowed in a logical sequence that should allow trained supply personnel to locate and retrieve anything from typewriter ribbons to torpedo parts within minutes. The ammunition ships were loaded according to a carefully calculated priority system that placed the most commonly requested ordnance in the most accessible positions, with backup stocks distributed throughout the holds to prevent a single hit from destroying critical supplies. Every vessel had manifest, cross-references, and trained crews who had practiced the procedures in Hawaii until they could process requisitions with assembly line efficiency. On paper, the system was flawless. A battleship or a beach could request supplies through standard Navy channels. The request would be processed by the squadron supply officer. The correct ship would retrieve the item from its organized holds, and delivery would happen faster than any land-based depot could manage because everything was already afloat and mobile. The Navy's planners believed they had solved the tyranny of distance that made Pacific logistics a nightmare, believed they had created a system so robust and self-sufficient that the fleet could operate indefinitely without returning to a major base, believed they could sustain a multi-division amphibious assault from ships that would arrive fully stocked and perfectly organized. They tested it in Hawaii with training exercises that seemed to validate every assumption, ran practice requisitions that came back exactly on schedule, loaded and unloaded cargo until the crews could do it in their sleep. The expectation was total. Service Squadron 10 would revolutionize naval warfare by making the supply line as mobile and flexible as the combat fleet itself, by turning logistics from a vulnerability into an advantage, by ensuring that no Marine would ever want for ammunition and no ship would ever want for parts because the floating railroad would deliver everything, everywhere, exactly when needed. It was the kind of innovation that wins wars, the kind of systematic thinking that transforms doctrine, and absolutely everyone from Nimitz down to the cargo handlers believed it would work because the theory was sound and the tests were successful, and nothing in the careful planning suggested that combat conditions might break the beautiful machine they had built. Saipan wasn't an anomaly, it was a preview, because the same structural failures repeated across every major operation where Service Squadron 10 deployed through the summer and fall of 1944. At Guam in July, the pattern replicated with surgical precision. Priority requisitions disappeared into the squadron's processing system and emerged days late or incomplete. Critical items were distributed across multiple vessels in a way that made tactical sense for safety but operational nonsense for speed. And the elegant cataloging system that worked flawlessly in Hawaiian exercises collapsed under the volume and urgency of actual combat requests where officers needed specific things immediately and couldn't wait for the proper alphanumeric search procedure. Medical supplies again became the most visible failure because wounded men don't wait for paperwork, and hospital ships found themselves radiating urgent requests for plasma and surgical kits while issue store ships 300 yards away carried abundant stocks that simply couldn't be located and transferred fast enough because the system had no mechanism for emergency prioritization beyond its careful pre-planned sequence. The Tinian operation in August exposed another crack when marine engineers needed specialized construction equipment to build an airfield under impossible deadlines, and the equipment existed somewhere in the squadron's inventory, definitely requisitioned and loaded in California. But assembling a complete functional unit required pulling components from 6 different ships because the load planners had distributed heavy equipment across the squadron for weight balance, which meant that getting one bulldozer operational required coordinating transfers and searches across multiple vessels while the construction timeline bled away. At Peleliu in September, the ammunition problem that first appeared at Saipan reached crisis levels when an unexpected Japanese defense-in-depth forced Marines to expend mortar and artillery rounds at 3 times the predicted rate, and while the squadron carried adequate reserves, those reserves were stowed in a sequence calculated for a different kind of battle, buried under ordnance types that weren't needed yet, requiring working parties to break the careful loadout and dig through tons of shells to reach the specific calibers the battalions were screaming for while taking casualties in coral caves that should have been neutralized with proper fire support. The repair ships, those floating machine shops that were supposed to keep damaged vessels operational without returning to Pearl Harbor, discovered their own version of the nightmare when they realized that having parts in inventory meant nothing if you couldn't find them fast enough to matter. And combat damage doesn't wait for a supply clerk to search through cross-reference manifests to locate a replacement valve or pump assembly. By Leyte Gulf in October, the supply officers had developed unofficial workarounds that essentially abandoned the system's core principles. They started pre-positioning high-demand items on weather decks regardless of proper stowage, maintained shadow manifests that reflected actual locations rather than planned locations, and established direct ship-to-ship communication networks that bypassed the official requisition channels because the official channels were so slow that men died waiting. The floating railroad was still floating and still carrying everything the fleet needed, but it had stopped functioning as a railroad, stopped delivering with precision and speed, and instead operated as a massive floating pile of correctly inventoried supplies that required increasingly desperate measures to actually extract and deliver when seconds counted, and the pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. The system worked brilliantly when tested under controlled conditions with predicted demands and adequate time, but real combat generated unpredictable demands with no time at all, and the beautiful organizational theory that governed Service Squadron 10 had no answer for the gap between what the plan said should happen and what the beach actually needed right now. The warnings existed before the first convoy ever sailed for combat, buried in technical assessments and after-action reviews that should have triggered fundamental reconsideration, but instead disappeared into the Navy's administrative machinery without altering the timeline or the doctrine. In March 1944, 3 months before Saipan, a series of large-scale logistics exercises conducted at Lahaina Roads off Maui exposed critical flaws in the requisition and retrieval system under simulated combat tempo, and the exercise observers filed reports noting that response times degraded catastrophically when request volume exceeded plan levels, that the alphanumeric storage system became a bottleneck rather than an efficiency when multiple urgent demands hit simultaneously, and that the careful loadout sequences assumed a battle profile that might not match reality. Those reports reached the Service Force-specific staff with recommendations to develop emergency override procedures and reconsider the distribution of high-demand items across multiple vessels. But the recommendations arrived while the squadron was already loading for deployment, and the operational timeline didn't permit redesigning a system that had taken 18 months to develop and that senior leadership believed would prove itself under actual conditions. Lieutenant Commander Howard Fulwiler, a Supply Corps officer assigned to evaluate the squadron's readiness, wrote a carefully worded assessment in April suggesting that the system's complexity made it fragile and that combat conditions might generate demand patterns the current organization couldn't handle efficiently, but his assessment was filed as a technical observation rather than a warning requiring action. Noted and acknowledged, and essentially ignored because the prevailing belief was that any growing pains would be resolved through experience and adaptation once the squadron deployed. The issue store ships themselves had revealed problems during the loading process in California when supply officers discovered that the master catalog system became nearly unmanageable once you loaded 20,000 line items into compartments that shifted during sea transport, and several officers recommended either reducing the inventory diversity or developing a simpler location system. But those recommendations conflicted with the core concept of making the ships function exactly like stateside depots with complete inventory, so the concerns were acknowledged and dismissed as lack of familiarity with the new procedures. More disturbing were the war game results from the Naval War College in late 1943, theoretical exercises that modeled Pacific Island campaigns and specifically tested whether mobile logistics could sustain multi-division assaults without fixed bases, and those games identified a critical vulnerability in the time required to locate and transfer supplies under combat pressure, suggesting that the system might work for sustained operations but could fail during the high-intensity demand spikes that characterized amphibious assaults. Yet the war game observations were treated as theoretical concerns that actual implementation would resolve rather than fundamental design flaws that require addressing before deployment. What emerges from the scattered documentation is not a picture of ignorance but of institutional momentum, a system so invested in its own innovation that contrary evidence was interpreted as implementation challenges rather than conceptual problems. A leadership structure that had committed to the floating railroad as the solution to Pacific logistics and couldn't afford to question that commitment once ships were being converted and crews were being trained and operational plans were being written around the assumption that Service Squadron 10 would work as advertised. The warnings were there, filed properly, routed through appropriate channels, acknowledged by competent officers, and then effectively neutralized by a planning process that had already decided the answer and wasn't interested in questions that might delay or derail the entire concept. So the convoys sailed towards Saipan carrying not just supplies but unresolved doubts that no one had authority or willingness to act on despite knowing that Marines would pay the price if the doubts proved justified. The price came due in increments measured in blood and lost time, paid by men who never saw the planning documents or the filed warnings, and who had no choice but to trust that the system would deliver what they needed to survive. On Saipan's northern ridges, a company of the 2nd Marine Division held a critical observation point for 3 days with dwindling ammunition because the mortar rounds they requested were somewhere in the anchorage being searched for, and they held until they couldn't anymore, pulled back under covering fire that ran dry halfway through the withdrawal. Left 2 squads pinned in positions they might have extracted from if the floating railroad had delivered the promised fire support when it was requested instead of when it was finally located. The casualties from that withdrawal weren't dramatic enough to make the official histories, just names in a casualty list filed under combat losses with no notation that some of those men bled out waiting for supplies that existed for miles offshore but couldn't be found fast enough to matter. The hospital ships treated the cost in different terms, in surgical delays that turned survivable wounds into amputations because plasma arrived 6 hours late, in infection rates that climbed because sterile supplies were stacked somewhere in the issue store ships under non-priority cargo and couldn't be extracted fast enough to prevent gangrene from taking hold in the tropical heat where every hour counted, and the floating railroad's careful procedures didn't account for the fact that wounded tissue doesn't wait for alphanumeric searches to run their course. Navy corpsmen worked with whatever they had on hand while watching men deteriorate from lack of materials that definitely existed in the task group but existed in the wrong place at the wrong time, and some of those corpsmen wrote letters home that never mentioned the system failure, just described the helplessness of watching preventable deaths happen because the supplies were there but not here, present but not accessible, inventoried but not deliverable. The repair ship crews experienced their own version of the cost when damaged destroyers and cruisers limped into the anchorage needing immediate mechanical attention to remain combat effective, and the repair ships had the parts and the skills but not the ability to locate critical components quickly enough to return vessels to the fight before the tactical situation moved on. So ships that should have been patching and returning to station instead sat dead in the water for days while supply officers searched through properly organized but practically inaccessible inventories, and every hour those ships sat idle was an hour the task group operated under strength against an enemy that didn't pause for logistics problems. Construction battalions on Tinian experienced the cost as impossible deadlines that became career-ending failures when the specialized equipment they needed to build airstrips under crushing time pressure was confirmed present in the squadron but couldn't be assembled into functional units fast enough. So engineers improvised with inadequate tools and fell behind schedule and faced official reprimands for delays caused by a supply system that worked beautifully on paper but failed catastrophically when men needed wrenches and cables and generators right now, not tomorrow after the proper transfer procedures ran their course. The psychological cost spread through the fleet as trust in the system eroded, As officers learned to hoard supplies and establish unofficial networks and bypass the formal requisition channels because the formal channels had proven unreliable under pressure, and that erosion of trust meant the Navy was now fighting two wars simultaneously. One against Japan and one against its own logistics infrastructure that had become an obstacle rather than an enabler. Sailors on the issue store ships felt it too. Worked 18-hour shifts tearing through holds trying to find items they knew were present. Felt the weight of urgent radio traffic requesting critical supplies while they searched through tons of correctly stowed but practically inaccessible cargo. Knew that somewhere ashore or afloat men were counting on them to deliver, and knowing they couldn't deliver fast enough no matter how hard they worked because the system itself was the bottleneck and individual effort couldn't overcome structural failure. The cost wasn't a single catastrophic loss that made headlines, but a distributed tax paid across dozens of operations in delayed casualties and extended suffering and tactical opportunities missed and operational tempo degraded, paid by men who trusted that someone had tested the system and verified it would work, and who discovered too late that trust had been misplaced. That the floating railroad was an elegant theory that killed quietly through inefficiency rather than dramatically through explosion, and the deaths it caused were never attributed to logistics failure in the official records, just listed as combat losses, even though the combat might have gone differently if the supplies had arrived when promised instead of when the system finally managed to deliver them. The floating railroad never officially failed because failure requires acknowledgement, and the Navy couldn't afford to acknowledge that its revolutionary logistics concept had nearly cost the Pacific Campaign. So instead, the system quietly transformed through unauthorized adaptations and workarounds until it bore almost no resemblance to the elegant theory that launched it. And by late 1945, Service Squadron 10 was still operating but using procedures its designers would barely recognize. Procedures developed by supply officers who had learned through blood and delay that innovation sometimes costs more than tradition, and that the gap between what should work and what does work is measured in lives lost waiting for bureaucracy to catch up with reality. The warnings that were filed and ignored in 1944 were never revisited, never became the basis for institutional learning or accountability, because revisiting them would require admitting that senior leadership had deployed an improved system into combat conditions where failure meant casualties. And that admission was politically impossible in a war the Navy was winning despite rather than because of its logistics revolution. The officers who raised concerns before Saipan were never vindicated and never punished, their warnings simply absorbed into the vast archive of military memoranda that accumulate without consequence, acknowledged in the moment and forgotten by history, and somewhere in that archive is the answer to a question the Navy never formally asked. When does institutional commitment to innovation become institutional negligence? And who decides whether the men who died waiting for supplies that existed but couldn't be delivered were casualties of war or casualties of a planning failure that could have been prevented if anyone with authority had been willing to listen to warnings that contradicted the approved solution? The system that was supposed to win the Pacific through revolutionary logistics instead won through the desperate adaptations of junior officers who abandoned doctrine to save lives. And the lesson that should have emerged, that complexity is fragile and elegance is not the same as effectiveness, and theory must prove itself before men stake their lives on it, never quite crystallized into policy, because the war ended and victory absolved all sins, and no one wanted to examine too closely how many of those sins were committed by the Navy against its own people in the name of progress. And if the floating railroad could sail into combat carrying fatal flaws that warning officers had already identified, how many other revolutionary systems were steaming toward the next war, carrying the same unexamined assumptions, the same beautiful theories that would collapse under real conditions while men who trusted the system paid the price for institutional arrogance disguised as innovation? And would anyone read those warnings either? Or would they too disappear into files marked important but not urgent while the next elegant disaster loaded its holds and set course for whatever beach came next?